Okay, so in this exercise, we'll look at some of the important principles of animation, namely arcs, timing and spacing, squash and stretch, and volume. And we're going to apply those to our 3D ball bounce. So you should have the 3D ball bounce file. If not, you can download it from the website. And it's already set up with the squash control and the main mover control. These are the two controls, part of the rigs, that move the geometry and control the effects of the geometry. So make sure that you're aware of the attributes and what they do. So first off, what we're going to do for this ball bounce is we're going to create a reference for the arcs of motion that the ball should follow. To do this, I'll go into the front view and I will create an EP curve, and we'll just start over to the left side of the 0, 0 grid line, and we'll have the ball kind of come in from the side and impact the ground, and then it will just do kind of a bounce. And if you don't like the way that your arc is going, you can just hit the delete key. But just be aware that this is just for reference. It's not anything that has to be set in stone. So there's the next bounce, and one more bounce, and then it will just kind of go off. Okay, so there's kind of our arc that we'll use as a guideline. Okay, so remember that the ball falls in an elliptical arc through space. Most things move in an arc of some kind. If the ball were to move in a straight line between high and low points of the bounce, then the action would look very unnatural and dull. So arcs of motion is a very important principle within animation. So let's view how we can use our controls to position our ball on the first entry arc. So I'll jump back and forth between my perspective view and my front view. I'll select both of the controls and hit E to rotate. So the ball will be coming in like that. Once we have the ball positioned, make sure we're on frame 1 of the timeline. Select both controls and we hit S. Okay? We make sure we're on our frame first, then position, then key. In order to reiterate that, let's do it again because our ball has to impact the ground. So I'll move to frame, let's say 7, select my move tool. I'm sorry, not my move tool, my main controller tool, then use my move tool by hitting W for the transform, and position the ball in the front view on the ground. Select both of my controls, hit E for the rotate tool, and rotate. Now, very important, when the ball hits the ground, it has to impact. So to give it the feel of an impact, we need to give it some squash and stretch, which is another principle of animation. In order to give it the appropriate amount of squash and stretch, we have to look at the distance it traveled and determine the correct volume, and make sure we maintain that volume through the stretch and the squash. All of those, volume and squash and stretch, and timing, and in fact distance deals with spacing, those are all principles of animation that we've discussed. So let's select our squash control, select the squash attribute, move into our view, and middle mouse button, squash it. Okay, you don't want to go exaggerating it. Just a little bit should be enough to give it the squash. So about there. I'll select my main control so I can make sure that the ball is indeed hitting the ground. Okay, now with both controls selected, I will hit the S key to keyframe that. So now the ball comes down and impacts. Now the problem, however, is that the ball starts squashing before it's impacted anything. So we have to fix that. In order to fix that, let's make sure that right before the ball impacts, it is stretched. Okay, so again, I'll select my squash tool or squash control, and we'll stretch it. And I'll select both controls, hit E, and we'll rotate so it can come in at the proper arc or angle that it was supposed to. And we'll hit S. So now if we scrub back in the timeline, the ball is coming down and makes an impact. So it looks fairly good, but the other issue is kind of the stretch happens a little bit too soon. I think there could be more spacing, or we could work on the timing of that stretch to make the impact seem more of an impact. If we just kind of scrub between the keyframe of the squash and stretch, it looks much more impactful than the whole entire animation that we've created thus far. So on frame 5, instead of having the ball stretched, I'm going to bring it back to 0. Select both controls and hit S to keyframe. So now the ball comes in, stretches, and makes an impact. Okay. Make sure that you right-click on your timeline and go to Playback Speed Real Time. So when you hit your play button in your control, you'll be playing at real time 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second depending on what you've set your preferences to. Mine are set to 24 frames a second. If it's every frame, it's not going to play accurately to the final animation. It needs to be set to real time. So when you hit play, you can actually see what it looks like. Remember, we can move our keys later on after we kind of get the main positions worked out. Then we can move keys and stretch time or shrink time down as we go. However, let's just continue making sure that our next bounce is going to bring the ball up accurately. So let's go to frame 12, for instance, and make sure we have our main mover, and we'll move the ball to its next keyframe position, and we'll make sure that it's not squashed at this point. It should be back to its original shape or volume at this point. Select both controls and hit S, and now we see, okay, it impacts pretty good, but then it kind of glides up like it's becoming non-squashed as it goes to its peak. And we should have the opposite of what occurred at impact happening when it climbs up the arc. So what we'll do on frame 8 is we will give it a little bit of a stretch. We'll select both controls, rotate them. The main control, you can move it up just a little bit, and we can rotate it a little bit more. Select both of them and hit S. So now we have an impact and we're beginning to climb. However, again, the same is going to be true. It's going to impact, it's going to stretch, and then after that one stretch, it's going to go back to its original volume. So again, select both controls after you've set the squash to 0 and hit S. Impact, and we climb up. So let's play that. And we can see it is going up. If we look at it from the front view, coming in and climbing up. And we're going to bring it down. And I don't really like how this end of the arc is. I don't like the guide that I made for myself, so I'm going to change it just a little bit. But we're going to make sure that we bring, again, the ball down to, using its main mover, down to an appropriate area, so I'll say about here. Use our squash to squash the ball just slightly. Main mover to make sure that it's back on the ground. Select both controls and hit S to key it. Now I have one issue, and the issue is that when I did this impact keyframe, I keyframed it on frame 13, so it's a one frame switch between the peak and the impact, and that's not very accurate. So what I need to do is I need to make sure I have both of the controls selected since I keyframed both of them, and I need to hold Shift, select that keyframe, and then move it, and let's move it to frame 17. So now you can see that red tick mark, that keyframe, is now moved for both of those. So now it goes up, and it takes a little bit longer to come down. However, make sure that your climb is 1 or 2 frames longer than the descent, than the fall, right? And we have the same issue we had again here. We have to repeat over here on the next impact. So in the front view, we'll make sure we go back frame 16, and I'm going to select both controls and rotate them slightly. Select my squash control and make sure that it's slightly stretched. Select both of them and hit S so that just before the impact it's stretched. And again, on that fall, we're going to make sure that there is no stretch until the very end. It doesn't gradually stretch. It goes from one right to the next, right to the next to make the impact much more believable. Okay, so now let's hit play. And there you go. So now we have our ball bounce. So we're going to continue working with arcs, timing, squash and stretch, and volume in order to make this ball bounce complete. And then once we have that, we'll look at how we can apply other principles of animation to the ball bounce and to other forms of 3D animation. Thank you.